Okay, so I think we'll make a start, and other people might join us as I'm doing the introductions. So a very warm welcome to tonight's lecture with Dr. Charlie Barnes, which is entitled Misrepresenting Gendered Violence is Crime Fiction Dealing in Caricatures. Thank you for joining us tonight, and we're thrilled to welcome Charlie for her first lecture with us, which is part of a programme of humanities lectures that we're hosting. And just to start off, my name is Paula Harrison, and I'm the coordinator of University Centre Telford. And for those of you who don't know, we're part of the University of Wolverhampton, and we're based in the heart of Telford in Shropshire. And normally we'd hold our public lecture programme in our centre in Telford, but obviously because of the current situation, we moved our lectures online. And we've had a very successful online programme reaching the far corners of the world, which has been fantastic. So before I introduce Charlie, there's just a couple of housekeeping things to go through. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the lecture via the Q&A button. And if you're using a laptop or a desktop, the icon is on the bottom of your screen in the middle. And if you're using a mobile, it will be in the top right-hand corner. And just to remind you that Zoom is a public platform and the lecture is being recorded, so please be careful about sharing any personal information. So Charlie is an author, poet, and academic based in Worcestershire, and we're delighted to be hosting her lecture tonight. She was the Worcestershire Poet Laureate for 2019-2020, but she's also well known for her fiction, publishing crime fiction novels as Charlotte Barnes and poetry as Charlie. She's a lecturer at the University of Wolverhampton in the Creative and Professional Writing Department, although she's lectured at various universities around the West Midlands, including Newman University and the University of Worcester. Charlie specialises in gendered roles and contemporary crime fiction, often exploring this through the practice-based research of her own writing. Charlie's most recent novel, All I See Is You, is published today, which is really exciting. We've just been talking about it. And here she writes a largely gender-neutral narrative of a protagonist who suffers memory lapses and therefore doesn't know what violent acts around them are theirs to claim. But you'll find no spoilers here. So a very warm welcome to Charlie, and I'll hand over to her now. Thanks very much, Charlie.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry I've had to do a bit of a lift and shift from one room to another, rather, because we suddenly had a rainfall behind me that was creating an unnecessary percussion, and I thought people aren't going to hear a word that I'm saying if I'm not careful. So we have a very, very quick costume change for the room that we're coming from this evening. So I will apologise in advance for anyone who loses sight of me in the next minute or two. I was saying to Paula, I think my Zoom is starting to suffer from a bit of end of semester fatigue or lockdown fatigue, and I'm conscious of having my screen on and doing a screen share, which might cause a bit of a lag. So if you lose me, as long as you've got the screen share, you have the best of this evening's entertainment. I can assure you of that much. So I will very quickly just pull up my screen share and I will hide myself away in this top corner. There we go. So thank you so much, Paula, for that introduction. As has already been covered, I'm Dr. Charlie Barnes. I work at the University of Wolverhampton. My research background is in gendered representations in contemporary crime fiction, and I have a kind of a bit of a specialist slant towards I suppose female violence or violent women, and how they are and aren't fairly represented in sort of contemporary fiction. So over the course of the next sort of 40 to 45 minutes, hopefully I won't go off on too many tangents, I'm hoping to establish a definition for the term domestic noir, which is something that comes up quite a lot, particularly in relation to women in contemporary crime. So we'll consider sort of what the meaning of this term is and what its purpose is for writers. And we'll also consider a little bit about how far this genre fairly represents or fairly misrepresents female violence, and how female violence is broadly represented or represented rather in different types of crime fiction. And I would like to kind of funnel this discussion, if you will, through the context of Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn, to consider how far Amy Dunn, who is the protagonist, the female protagonist rather, of that novel, is a serious revision of female violence, or whether she is kind of slightly more of a problematic one. So I will warn you now, if you haven't seen Gone Girl or read Gone Girl, I am about to ruin it for you. So feel free to lower your volume once we get to those slides, if you're hoping for the punchline of the book to remain a surprise. So domestic noir then, just to kind of couch it in terms of its history. So it was coined by Julia Crouch back in 2013. Julia Crouch is actually a particularly well-known contemporary crime writer, and on sending out an agented piece of writing to try and find a suitable publishable home for it, or publishing home for it rather, Crouch took some kind of serious umbrage to the fact that her work was being described as crime fiction, and she also felt that branding it as a psychological thriller or psychological mystery or anything along those lines also kind of failed to capture the nuances of what it was she was actually trying to explore within her work. So to better situate it in sort of a more specific context, or a more tailored context, her publicist, Sam Eads, she had a conversation with him, I believe it was actually during a live festival discussion that this came about. And between the two of them, they kind of thrashed out what Crouch's intentions were in the writing, and what it was that she was really trying to sort of poke holes in, I suppose, for want of a better term. And between the two of them, they negotiated this idea of domestic noir. And from this sort of initial conception, a fuller definition was involved, kind of as the genre grew and as it took on steam with other people who soon discovered were also writing in this genre, albeit kind of unknowingly initially. Now Crouch actually defines it as follows. So she commented, in a nutshell, domestic noir takes place primarily in homes and workplaces, concerns itself largely with the female experience, is based around relationships, and takes as its base a broadly feminist view that the domestic sphere is a challenging and sometimes dangerous prospect for its inhabitants. So she was kind of very much sort of peddling this perspective then, that the domestic sphere was somewhere that could be challenged as being kind of a conventionally safe female space, and that we could see it as this landscape in which kind of more dangerous things could happen than we had perhaps considered as part of contemporary fiction at the very least. Now, since this original definition came about, other authors and academics alike have explored the term and kind of like the ethos and mentality that fuels the term, and helps it to kind of continue to change shape, really, as more and more people are writing towards it. It's since resulted in entire academic publications that now discuss and analyse how place and space is used by females, whether that be female writers or female characters, to explore acts of violence to some degree. There isn't necessarily a prerequisite for this being female violence. It's certainly an option, but as we will kind of come to consider in more detail a little bit later in the lecture, the flavours of female violence, as it were, are really quite limited and limiting in terms of what's actually available to the cast of characters that are being sort of shoehorned into these domestic narratives. So broadly speaking then, there are kind of, as with any genre, as with any subgenre, there are more specific pockets of domestic noir that are kind of coming about the larger the genre itself becomes. So there will be more specific examples, but to kind of paint it in very broad brushstrokes, these novels are conventionally characterized by first-person narratives written from flawed or immoral female protagonists, and I use kind of flawed and immoral in kind of a relatively fast and loose sense, actually, because much like the violence itself that I am here to discuss a little, the flawed and immoral traits of these women are often things that we have already seen on male characters, but they haven't made them flawed and they haven't made them immoral. There is something flawed and or immoral about these characteristics once they are pinned on a female protagonist, which is not entirely dissimilar to how the violence itself works, but again, that's something that we will swing back to a little later. They are conventionally rooted in a domestic setting. As Crouch outlines in her own definition, there is a little fluidity here in terms of whether a domestic setting is actually the home landscape or sometimes the work landscape. There is kind of a clever bleed through between those two settings that comes about in some domestic noir publications, wherein you will find, for instance, a first-person narrative of a au pair or kind of like a governess figure, wherein the domestic becomes the workplace as well as the home of usually a competing female. So there is a little fluidity in terms of how that domesticity is actually portrayed as part of the settings of these works. The authors are largely female themselves, and they work to kind of pervert what is stereotypically a female space or a feminine space into a landscape wherein female revolt of some description can take place. And this in itself is quite a sort of a feminist approach to contemporary writing, really. May as well get that F word out of the way as early as possible. Quite a feminist approach to contemporary writing, because the likes of Betty Friedan, for example, were often talking about domestic settings as spaces in which the female could somehow become deviant or defective, which is something that comes about a lot through this style of writing. And the genre attempts to be illustrative of the multiple ways in which a housewife figure can somehow malfunction in modern society. So the domestic sphere it often depicts is also typically the site of a troubled marriage, which tends to fuel whatever negative behaviours it is that the female protagonist is exhibiting. So it's really quite interconnected, with kind of one element being very heavily dependent on another in terms of carrying the entire story, and it's a very intricately balanced genre in that sense, but still certainly quite a lot of space for innovation when it comes to the plot lines. So female violence within domestic noir then. So given that domestic noir creates this space in which women are or can be somehow defective, this can mean any number of things, but most commonly looks at the ways in which the psychological boundaries of a female character can be pushed. So this may ultimately lead to acts of mental and physical violence inflicted by these women, but to varying degrees. And when I say to varying degrees, what is, I suppose, quite apparent from a large body of this work is that the female character, whoever she may be inclined towards inflicting mental violence of some description or psychological violence, but the physical violence is not kind of as open quote traditional close quote as we may perhaps find exhibited by male characters in crime fiction. So in that respect, there is something very significant through the ways in which these acts of female violence are non-physical and therefore kind of psychologically or emotionally abusive instead, but also something that's quite significant about the structure of female the structure of female violence as part of this genre is that while all violence is to some extent reactive to some stimulus or another, generally speaking, the female violence as it is exhibited in domestic noir is reactive to male behaviours. So there is a very specific catalyst at play insofar as what it is that drives these women to act out in some way. A couple of sort of lesser known novels that really I suppose portray this in the most clear way that I've encountered then. So Muriel Sparks' The Driver's Seat, which is actually a very under discussed novel in Sparks' back catalogue, but also in terms of how the female violence can be depicted. So in this novel, the violence, open quote, close quote, is something that destroys the life of a man through a series of actions that are very much engineered by the female character. But the literal violence itself is something that is very man-held and man-led. And in the context of this novel is something that ultimately results in the death of the woman. So even though it is the woman who is kind of like the psychological and the emotional aggressor, as it were, for her violence to really come to fruition as part of her narrative, she has to herself die in order for that violence to really take effect, I suppose. And a slightly more contemporary example than Sparks' Driver's Seat is Nothing Natural by Jenny Dinsky. So this novel is perhaps an even clearer example of something that could be very early domestic noir. The Driver's Seat actually takes place sort of during the female protagonist's holiday, or what appears to be a holiday. So in that sense, it deviates from domestic noir characteristics. Meanwhile, Nothing Natural, which if memory serves right, was published in the 80s. Absolutely should have written that down. You'll have to forgive me, dear listeners. If memory serves right, was published in the 80s, but it is largely rooted in a domestic setting. So it takes place predominantly in the home, or certainly around the topic of the home life of the female protagonist. And as part of this domesticity, or perhaps perverted domesticity, our female protagonist actually engages in a explicitly violent sexual relationship with a man who she knows very little about. Their romantic encounters are quite limited to her home, and they often happen either at his request, if he's feeling particularly polite, more likely happen at his demand, which I think is how the majority of their encounters are negotiated. And significantly then, when the protagonist, when the female protagonist fails to get the emotional support that she either needs or wants from the male character, she goes as far to engineer the acting out of a violent sexual act that is very much illegal, and she engineers it in such a way that the man performing this act with her coincides with them being discovered by police officers who soon arrive at her property, and because of the woman's ingenuity, cruelty, depending on your perspective, but because of the way in which she structured this scenario, they believe that he's been assaulting her, and they arrest him and take him away, and he's escorted off narrative, and that's kind of how their story closes. So in that sense, then, she is a very clear example of how female violence is something that comes about through psychological torture. Seems like a strong word perhaps, but certainly psychological abuse, that the woman herself is then the person that has to kind of suffer the physical consequences of, and this is something that kind of looks to happen again and again throughout examples of domestic noir, even into more contemporary expressions of it from say the last 10 years or so. So a handful of publications that belong to this genre then, it may be that you recognise some or all of these perhaps, because they are very well-known publications now. I think the majority of them, it may only be Cuckoo by Julia Crouch that hasn't been adapted into a motion picture. Meanwhile, The Girl on the Train and everything that follows it actually has. They've done very well as media adaptations. I believe that they've all been relatively loyal to their original source text as well, which is particularly interesting given how often things usually change as part of adaptations somehow. What is particularly interesting about some of these texts then is that they belong to a time period that actually comes before Crouch's coining of the domestic noir term, so they kind of add credence to the fact that this isn't necessarily a new phenomena. This is certainly something that's been happening in crime fiction, in psychological thrillers, by any other name would smell as sweet. And what is particularly interesting to me then is we need to talk about Kevin from this list, which if memory serves right is actually the earliest publication out of all of them. It was initially released some time before the domestic noir term even kind of came about in contemporary fictions, and since this coining of the term, if you will, it's since been traced back to this idea of marriage thrillers, which is something that kind of picked up steam post World War II, but shows us that this certainly didn't start with Julia Crouch, nor did it start with We Need to Talk About Kevin, which was early 2000s, but rather decades upon decades ago, during which time men in society and fiction alike came to represent these sort of psychological extremes because of what had happened to them during their wartime experiences, and they kind of came to break the ground for the domestic as this space in which revolt of some description or another could take place. So far from this being sort of a chronological list necessarily of books that relate to Julia Crouch's first discussion around this term, it's certainly something that sort of predates much of our contemporary awareness of it as something that we can put a label to. So which way is female violence facing then in terms of sort of its placement or its execution, for want of a better term perhaps, as part of domestic noir then? So from texts that have already been alluded to, female violence, or it's clear that female violence is something that is typically turned on the self. A lot of the women in domestic noir publications are troubled because they have inner demons of some descriptions, and whatever it is that they are battling usually results in their own sort of physical endangerment to some degree. So psychologically speaking, this is often also true to life, and it therefore makes some sense that this reality would kind of bleed through into contemporary fictions. Studies that have been done on real living, breathing female violence show that women are much more likely to enact violence on themselves than they are on others. So it is understandable to some degree that this has been kind of carried through into crime writing. That said, in a genre, and if we consider crime writing broadly now, but in a genre that has historically worked to play about with transgressions in society and culture and the people that kind of exist between those precarious spaces, sometimes it feels somewhat limiting and indeed limited that female violence is something that is still encouraged towards the self rather than encouraged towards the cast of characters around whoever the leading female may be. Particularly if we are looking to construct sort of transgressive females, or even women that sort of push boundaries in the most mildest of senses. So it seems that there is perhaps a missed opportunity then for the ways in which female violence is being expressed, because we are being a little too prescriptive in the parts of real life that we are borrowing from to create female violence in fiction. So in terms of how Gillian Flynn's Gone Girl has impacted on this then, again, I will underscore the fact that there are certainly spoilers that are about to come up, so I apologise in advance if I am robbing you of the experience of reading Gone Girl for yourselves, although it is very entertaining for lots of reasons. So spoilers aside, I would heartily recommend picking up a copy. To press on then, so Gone Girl is a split narrative of Nick and Amy Dunn, who are very much an unhappily married couple. The first portion of the book is told from the perspective of Nick. During this time, Amy has gone missing, is as much as we know from the opening chapters. She is believed to be dead. The prime suspect in her supposed death looks to be her philandering husband. There is a mounting pressure to find Amy, because even though she is believed to be dead, they have kind of no proof of her death at this point in the narrative. There is quite a public search going on for her very, very quickly. She becomes kind of a bit of in the context of the novel, she becomes a bit of a poster child for what happens if you are in an unhappy marriage or in an abusive marriage. But Nick, of course, has his own motivations for finding her, because he is telling us as the reader that he hasn't in fact killed her. We soon discover that Nick, while he is trying to find his wife, while he does appear to be very tortured, while he does have lots of arguably sincere or insincere emotions of his own, there are also elements of Nick's lifestyle tailored to make us dislike him. He is not a loyal husband. He is not particularly respectful of his partner. And because of that, we have very mixed feelings about him from the opening of the book. Continuing on from that, sort of alongside these discoveries of Nick as a character, we also start to find out things about Amy as a character, the most significant detail of this being that she isn't in fact dead, but she certainly wants people to believe that she is. So through a series of carefully constructed clues, she makes it quite plain to Nick that, and subsequently to the reader as we learn more and more of what the real Amy has done. But these carefully constructed clues then are left behind to stage her death to some whilst revealing what she's done to others being Nick. So he soon finds out that all of this has happened kind of to punish him for his indiscretions. And along this complex revenge narrative, Amy does actually perform a number of violent acts, some of which are very physically violent, including quite a gruesome murder against the person who is actually protecting her at the time, only for her to eventually come home, fabricate a story that exonerates her husband, and subsequently she blackmails him into staying with her, even though there is so many reasons at this point in the text why that is a terrible idea for both of them. So in terms of the critical worth of this narrative, several critics have actually gone as far to state that Amy Dunn was presented as being some sort of a psychopathic female. Now, noting the markers of a psychopath in a stricter psychological sense, Amy's emotional reactions to the behaviours of those around her suggest that she is frankly far too emotional to suffer from psychopathy. There is no evidence within the text to suggest that she is suffering from this affliction. There is maybe an argument for sociopathy, but we'll come to that slightly later. That said, it doesn't mean that she doesn't kind of make an interesting case for how female violence can be enacted and female violence can be explored. But what Amy kind of does or can, I suppose, underscore for us is that we need to separate out this idea of violent characters and psychopathic characters, because Amy is certainly not an example of a high functioning psychopath, or even much of a functioning psychopath, actually. What is interesting about kind of Flynn's portrayal of Amy as a violent character, though, is that alongside misdeeds that we're already aware of, Amy also engages in theft. She portrays violence against other women. She deserves kind of credit where it's due for a mastermind plan in having escaped her marriage in the first instance. There is obviously a very clear abuse of power insofar as female victimhood, which has caused quite a lot of problems with feminist critics. Amy falsifies a diary wherein she regales kind of an imagined reader with the abuse that she suffered at the hands of Nick, which is not true and was very much kind of created as part of this elaborate escape plan. And she also falsifies claims of sexual and physical abuse from the man that she then goes on to murder, in fact, as part of her own escape. So she's a multi-layered character, to say the very least, but there are kind of extremes at play here that sort of undercut the sincerity of Amy's violence as, I suppose, something that we can really buy into. It as readers, it asks us to sort of stretch our belief system just a little too far in terms of what it is she's doing and what it is she might be capable of. So through this, then, Flynn portrays not only a violent female, but a violent female who has quite a clear ability for careful and considered planning to various degrees. Amy is evidently fond of psychological and emotional manipulation. She shows a lot of forethought and adaptability. Huge amounts of research goes into her escape route out of her marriage. Also, kind of alongside that, not only how she gets away from Nick, but also how she engineers evidence to make it look as though Nick may have actually killed her. And this is something that Amy must logically have started kind of months in advance of having actually left Nick. So there is a lot of forethought. There is a huge amount of research involved in her in her escape. She shows meticulous eye for detail, and she also shows kind of a willingness to inflict some real physical harm on another human being, whether that is another woman or whether it is one of the poor men that kind of happen to encounter her over the course of the novel. So with all of this in mind, and kind of attaching this to some of my earlier comments about this female violence as it is depicted in domestic noir, what is actually the problem with Gone Girl, or is there a problem with Gone Girl? So in some contrast to the I suppose the more positive reviews of the book, it has actually been suggested that Gone Girl just pushes us a little too far when it comes to what we are asked to believe, and what it is that we can really sort of buy into. She is a mastermind of epic proportions. It has to be said, and because of that, there is a little question mark over whether she is in fact sort of the feminist icon that some have claimed her to be. There was an awful lot of kind of complementary literature released that suggested that she had been afforded the same intellect and credulity as her male counterparts had in other works of the same genre, i.e. Amy Dunn is a strong feminist character because she is being portrayed how men have been portrayed in crime fiction, but that kind of argument doesn't really hold as much weight as we need it to fully excuse all of the things that are happening in the book. And alongside that, then, while Amy may very much sort of function as this reimagined femme fatale figure, and she is very much sort of relying on some of those very classic nuanced ideas of what a dangerous woman, open quote, close quote, may be within the context of crime fiction, there are as many grounds to argue kind of off the back of that she actually relies too heavily on negative stereotypes and belief systems, particularly when it comes to things like the fictionalized diary, in which she is leaning very heavily on female victimhood, which is, I mean, hugely problematic for a number of reasons. And it was David Cox, I believe, who said that the diary as a tool in the context of the novel is something that is designed to kind of capitalize on the presumption of women as victim. So while she is sort of powering forwards with in some respects to kind of reimagine what the woman is capable of, she's only able to do that because she's relying so heavily on the stereotypes that we're actively trying to work away from with each kind of wave of feminism that we work through. Alongside that, then, an additional problem with Amy's character is that she truly lacks the depth that she needs. So the fact that she is, allegedly a very intelligent character, but not someone who at any point stops to interrogate their behaviours or interrogate their own behaviours, seems very, very unlikely. There is kind of a lack of introspection and a lack of awareness that someone of her meticulous nature would, quite frankly, need. And secondly, there's also kind of a notable inconsistency across the violence that she enacts as well. So we learn throughout the course of the novel that Amy has previously fabricated stalking allegations, which is obviously kind of a non-physical, emotional sort of violence. But she has also sort of inflicted violence on herself. She, during one incident, scratches up her own face and then blames another woman for having done it to her. So she will go to different extremes, but they sit in such polarization from each other, it becomes really quite difficult to see how point A, wherein Amy is exhibiting a non-physical violent act, act, for example, through the way to point F, let's say. Point F being much later in the novel, when readers are told how she cuts a man's jugular open, and not only is that in itself obviously quite a violent act, but we're told that she does so with such a level of specificity that he would have bled out within seconds of the injury happening. So while Amy's role as a housewife can and rightly should be questioned throughout the book as a whole, and in critical discussions of her, kind of her representation as a cold-blooded killer leaves a little something to be desired when it comes to its authenticity, particularly given the fact that Flynn looks to move between sort of like female violence and male violence with no gradation or discussion between these two polarizations. So there are an awful lot of gendered comments happening throughout the book, which is something that we'll come to in more detail in a second or two. But kind of with that in mind, then, the fact that we go from what is a very conventionally female violent act, as in stalking allegations or inflicting violence on the self, through to cutting a man's throat open, we begin to border on the cartoonish in terms of how suddenly self-aware Amy is, insofar as her ability to enact violence on another person, and it doesn't entirely carry, particularly when you compare it to other explorations of violence in contemporary crime fiction, whether it's a psychopathic character, a male character, or even a female character. So the extreme gendering of the violence then would perhaps be less problematic if there weren't so many clear comments happening about gendered behaviour throughout the book. So from the beginning of the narrative, Amy and Nick very much gravitate towards and away from what is expected of both of them as man and woman, and as husband as wife. There's a really, really heavy lean on Amy as the good wife, and Amy is the good character, let's say, and Nick is the baddie. And I think because Flynn has sort of leaned so heavily on this already, we very much have this like male versus female polarization in our heads already, which again is kind of carried into the violence that we've seen Amy enact as a younger woman, but not so much carried through to the violence that we need to believe she's enacted in having murdered a man. So an additional significance can kind of be placed on here then through Amy's cool girl speech, which has been kind of branded by some as being the book's cultural legacy, because it's particularly well known, it's particularly well quoted. In this, Amy very much discusses sort of anticipated female roles, roles that are encouraged or enforced by men, that kind of by and large ask a woman to be quiet and considerate of her husband's feelings, and not too bothered about whether she feels uncomfortable with things as long as her partner is comfortable with them. So on account of these sort of overt gender comments, then it becomes quite a challenge to see Amy's behaviour and subsequently Amy's violence as anything other than a continuation of these gendered ideas and gendered ideals. But in trying to kind of put this together as a continuation, the violence becomes too much by the end of the book. There isn't a natural trajectory to it. It doesn't feel sort of respectful of how violence does actually escalate as part of the human psyche. And because of that, Amy kind of loses some of her authenticity or potential for authenticity as a violent woman. So Amy as a violent character then is ultimately not afforded the same level of as psychological sophistication. Goodness, sorry, you can tell we're etching towards 7 o'clock. Not afforded the same level of psychological sophistication that violent men are afforded in the landscape of crime fiction. So as I've kind of already alluded to, she's not a psychopath. There is argument for her to be branded as a sociopath, but that's not a key element of the story. Flynn doesn't necessarily give a reader enough information for us to really kind of buy into that possibility, but instead she doesn't sit as someone who is inherently violent, someone who has a natural trajectory towards escalated violence, but instead she is an extreme version of a scorned housewife. And with this in mind, like, her violence again is reactive, which all violence is to some degree, but Amy's violence is explicitly and overtly reactive to the fact that her husband has been unfaithful to her, which is a very female motivation in the context of crime writing. So the reason that this is problematic, by and large, is that all it really does, kind of when you boil down what Amy's motivations are, is that Gone Girl essentially just offers us another instance wherein female behaviours are dictated by male ones. So rather than Amy enacting violence through want or desire, which is something that fictional men often do, she instead weaponizes it and uses it as a tool for revenge against a husband who, after punishing him and then some, she then decides to resume her relationship with anyway. So this sort of just reinforces the assessment that her violence is psychologically sophisticated, and while that doesn't discredit it entirely, it does prevent it from being kind of a true feminist tool in the context of domestic noir as a feminist genre, which is what many people and many critics indeed kind of assume this genre space to be. Ultimately kind of leads us to the closing question then of whether domestic noir is feminist, and I think it is perhaps the most fair answer to that question to say that it certainly has the potential to be feminist, but novels within the genre ultimately need to be treated on kind of a case-by-case basis. So to afford them deserved credit in perverting this like female terrain of the domestic, they do create a landscape wherein women can become defective, and with that in mind, they are leaning very well and very effectively on kind of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, rather, wherein she discussed this female space as somewhere that transgressions could take place, and that is very much what domestic noir is kind of trying to portray. However, if they persist in playing into stereotyped roles historically afforded to them, either kind of as a scorned woman or as a femme fatale figure, just as the most readily available ones, all they actually do is kind of persist in reinforcing these outdated gendered ideas. So it kind of creates this landscape wherein we are sort of leaning on the same stereotypes that we're actively trying to work against, and that's sort of the dangerous element of domestic noir, if you will, and that's sort of the line that needs to be sort of carefully trod in the interest of making sure that these novels actually are sort of actively contributing towards contemporary feminist discussion. So in terms of overcoming this, my argument is, and has been for some time now, is that fiction is perhaps a space in which we could afford to de-gender violence entirely. So we cannot kind of jump the hurdle of the fact that men are statistically more violent than women in real life. That is kind of a tried and tested element of the Western world. But insofar as the representations of this in fiction, there is a space to move violence slightly further along the gendered spectrum to show that women are actually capable of it as well, and women are capable of bad behaviours, open quote, close quote, whatever those bad behaviours may be, in a way that they've not previously been presented as being capable of. So there is a need for kind of wiggle room then in this sort of bid for equality that we are allegedly actively working towards. And this isn't an argument to be made for kind of portraying women as the bad characters necessarily, but rather creating a space in which women are allowed to own their rage and own their violence. The female psychopath, whilst I mean, like, statistically less likely, or is statistically less likely in terms of a formal diagnosis, they do exist. They have been known to exist in the world at large, and there is an argument then, if we move violence along ever so slightly in terms of our gendered representations of it, we are making a space for modern day rage to be enacted by female characters without it having to be sort of tacked onto whatever it is that the men around them have done. So while I appreciate that statistically women are less likely to engage in violent acts, it feels very biologically reductionist to take it away from them entirely. And furthermore, kind of to end on then, if we entertain the idea that you know, this is how it is in reality, surely fiction is the space to reinvent that. And we have to use fiction as a landscape in which we can have fantasy and magic and violent women alike, because we need to be able to explore this character and explore her place in contemporary writings, not just as someone who sits alongside a defective male character, for want of a better term for it, but as someone who is exploring her own feelings, as someone who is enacting on her own feelings, whether she be an inherently violent woman or whether she be someone who slowly escalates up towards it. And it is a way in which to move away from this idea that all women have an inherent goodness while all men have an inherent rage, which is kind of as biological reductionist for men as it is for women. So thank you very much for your time. I hope that you have enjoyed this as much as I have, because I feel as though I could go on for hours yet. But in the interest of not keeping you here until the wee hours of the morning, I will stop my screen share, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlie. That was fascinating. Thank you very much. Really, really enjoyed that. So we can now, Charlie can now take questions. So if anybody would like to post questions in the Q&A, we've got a thank you already from Nicola. That's great. Thank you for that. So anybody got any questions for Charlie? Okay.
I think once I've talked about female violence for an hour, sometimes people are too scared to ask.
No, we've got some questions here. Fantastic paper, Charlie, from Daisy Black. Really sorry for the brain dump long question. Your discussion of domestic noir reminded me a lot of the 19th century complex, villainous, manipulative women of plays like Ibsen's Hedda Gabler and Strindberg's The Father, as well as characters like du Maurier's Rebecca and Mrs. Danvers. I know we tend to think of marriage thrillers as quite a recent thing, but are Amy and Friends actually part of a long tradition of domestic women gone bad? Isn't it quite depressing that still these women can't be monstrous in their own right, like modern male thriller antagonists, but instead have to be first hurt by an incompetent man the texts seem to want to get us to sympathise with?
Oh, Daisy, I feel like we need to have coffee and a discussion. No, I absolutely think that there's kind of an argument to be made that Amy is part of a long-standing tradition, essentially, and I think I think to some extent that's probably why Flynn tries to push her as far as she does, because she is trying to reinvent something that has actually, or rather someone who has actually existed as part of domestic thrillers or marriage thrillers, or kind of by any other name, whatever it is that they've been called by different academics over the years. But I think in trying to kind of reinvent what already existed, she's made her into a caricature, hence the title of this discussion, because Amy doesn't have the same trajectory as a male showing that level of violence. And I agree with you entirely, Daisy, that it really is quite depressing that we're kind of still living in and writing in this framework where, because we believe women to be inherently good, we can only extend our belief in them as monstrous individuals if they've been driven to it, which seems kind of as reductionist as the idea that they are inherently good in the first instance. So yes, I certainly think that Amy is kind of part of a long-standing tradition, but I think she's perhaps marriage thriller 2.0, who doesn't yet quite have all of the kinks worked out of her as a character.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. And Jason says, discussing the origins of domestic noir, you mentioned that Julia Crouch wanted a label that did justice to the nuances of her fiction. And in asking whether domestic noir is feminist, you suggest taking it on a case-by-case basis. Doesn't the idea of genre necessarily flatten the nuances of individual texts and the ability to consider texts on a case-by-case basis?
What a very good question.
Yes.
I think it depends on the way in which you're using the term genre. I think particularly when you're dealing with something like crime fiction, which is what domestic noir belongs to, even though it is huge and all-encompassing for the writers that exist within it. But I think because we are dealing with something that has such long-standing traditions, and such changing traditions, that genre can perhaps be used as this kind of baseline characteristics or baseline set of characteristics that people can kind of build upon and take away from accordingly, depending on which sector of crime they're going into, which feels like a bit of a clunky way of phrasing it, but I think in the interest of kind of making sure that texts have room to breathe, there are certain elements of any genre that an author can give into and take away from, and all the rest of it. So I don't necessarily think it's problematic to use domestic noir as a genre that has kind of certain tailored qualities that differentiate it from other styles of crime fiction, but that, like any type of crime fiction, it also needs space for people to sort of, I suppose, explore their own agendas, which I think is what most creative writers are doing anyway.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Charlie. And Daisy just says she'd love to have a virtual coffee and a chat. Your paper has sparked so many connections. Thank you. Josiane says, thank you, Charlie. Have you done research on real psychopaths for your creative writing novels?
Yes, yes is certainly the short answer to that. Yes, when I was doing my doctorate degree in particular, my doctorate degree was in creative writing, and I was exploring representations of female violence in contemporary crime fiction. And my own creative writing as part of my doctorate degree was a novel called Intention, the narrator for which was designed to be a female psychopath. So I read as far and wide as I could stomach to read, essentially, about psychopathy and the diagnostic criteria for it and the early warning signs of it, and all of these other very scary things. But the good thing about that is that once you know those things, you just know them, and you can kind of carry that into future writing projects. But yes, I did, and I have done a lot of research on like diagnosed psychopaths, both violent and non-violent, because I think it's quite important to sort of uphold that distinction between the two. So yes.
Okay, thank you. Julia says, thanks, Charlie. Really interesting. Do you have any thoughts about whether domestic noir has a relationship with the golden age of the detective novel, many of which were written by women?
I think there's something really interesting to be said about the relationship between female writers and crime as a genre. Just broadly, kind of across as a whole. I think it's particularly interesting that after this golden age, there is now this blossoming genre wherein women have much more of a dominance, I suppose. And what's particularly interesting about domestic noir, for example, from the list of novels that I put up as part of the presentation, there was one there called Before I Go to Sleep by S.J. Watson, which was a hugely successful domestic noir novel. And S.J. Watson is a male author who, interestingly enough, chooses to write under his initials for whatever reason. But obviously, you know, kind of historically speaking, women have written under their initials to kind of de-gender themselves as part of their writing. So I think that there's a really interesting conversation to be had about why so many female crime writers are going into crime. And I do wonder whether the golden age essentially sort of paved the way for that, because it is the likes of Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers who people kind of have carried into even contemporary readerships. Like Agatha Christie, for example, just seems to go in and out of fashion. Like she never loses steam in many ways. So I think there's certainly a relationship. I'm not entirely sure what it is, but I like to think of Agatha Christie as kind of like paving the way for female crime writers in the contemporary years. And kind of, you know, it's huge significance on top of that is this idea that well, this idea, not even that, is this reality that female crime writers are outselling male crime writers at the moment, for example. So even though sort of historically speaking, perhaps pre-golden age, maybe, it's been very much a male-dominated genre, there's absolutely some wiggle room now, and I think domestic noir and similar subgenres is probably tied up with that in some way.
Okay, thank you. We've got another question. I just wondered if you'd considered where child killing fits into this analysis, particularly the Medea mother murder type.
I think, oh goodness, this feels like a really hideous thing to say. That seems to be one of the few sanctioned representations of female violence, and I use that very, very loosely, and in no way condone the behaviour, of course. But I think, I suppose my reservation with that as an expression of female violence is that it's this assumed maternal nature that's actually under interrogation here. And I think there might even be two conversations to be had insofar as whether it's a woman killing children or a woman killing her own children. Mm-hmm. Because if it's a female character who is killing her own children, she is somehow defective as a mother, which is as much a mark on her womanhood or on her assumed womanhood as it is anything else. Whereas if it is a female character who is killing children, I feel quite justified in saying, statistically speaking, she's probably working with a male character. I don't think it's often something that you get. I would be intrigued to know of examples, so if anyone has any, like, please do get in touch after the lecture and say, here's a horrible book you might like to read, because I love it when people get in touch with me to say that. So I think even though it feels like an unpleasant line to draw down the center of that, I think it very much depends on whose children are in question, because it may be something to do with being defective as an inherent mother, which is just kind of another assumed trait of, like, the real woman that people have been writing towards for so many years now.
Brilliant, thank you. And the family says, great answer, thank you, I agree.
Thank you.
That's gone down well.
That's a relief.
Josiane asks, who reads crime fiction, men or women?
I believe that more women read it, actually. It's as a genre, it's never gone out of fashion, and I think there's something really interesting that happens through reading crime in terms of reinforcing our own ideas of law and order, which I think is why crime has never gone out of fashion, because we as a species like stories where the bad guy is caught at the end. But I think there is a slight tilt in favour of a female readership, as well as a female authorship, particularly in contemporary settings.
Interesting. Okay. Has anybody got any more questions? Oh yes. Again from Fanwy. One last one. How does age fit in? I've written a female murderer who is elderly and plays with the fact that no one notices her.
I think that's an excellent way of going about it. I think there's some really, really interesting comments to be made there in terms of when women become invisible, because there is an age after which women just seem to drop off the radar. And I think there's something really interesting to be played about with there in terms of how that would work in crime fiction. And I would be really interested to read that, just as a gentle aside. I think there are actually a handful of cases of older female poisoners who often weren't noticed, because people just weren't paying attention to them effectively. I think it's Velma Barfield is absolutely worth having a little look into. She wrote a memoir of her time on death row after she was arrested for poisoning several people, and she got away with it for kind of the length of time that she did because no one was looking for her, or no one expected it of her. So there is certainly something interesting happening, or there is potential for something interesting to happen with, like, the older female murderer. But I think it was Peter Vronsky, I may be going back quite a few years now, and he may well have updated this claim, but Peter Vronsky, in one of his discussions on female violence, actually kind of was bold enough to say that he estimated one in every 6 serial murderers in the United States was a woman, because statistically that was kind of the number game that he could make work, but no one was looking for them. So there's something very interesting to be said about invisibility after a certain age in all female characters, but I think you could play around with that in a very interesting way for crime writing.
Yes, most definitely. And Daisy says that she'd love to read the book about the older female murderer. What a great idea. Josie Ann said she's read your book Intention and it's very scary.
Yeah, no one ever looks at me in the same way after that book.
Okay, well, I think that's it for questions. So thank you ever so much, Charlie. That's provoked a lot of discussion.
Thank you.
Scary.
Yeah, thank you so much for such wonderful questions from everyone as well. I'm always ever so nervous that there will just be stone silence after these things. So yeah, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed coming along.
Okay, that's brilliant. And Mafanui says that so far it's only published in Welsh, her book, but she does have an English PDF. So if you did want to send that to University Centre Telford, then we can pass that on to Daisy. So that's great. Thanks ever so much, Charlie. And thank you very much to everybody who's attended. That was a really great lecture and a really interesting debate. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye
you very
now.
much. Bye-bye. Thank you for coming.